Previously, on One Last Kiss, Eleanor and her father have moved back to Shadow Glen, Virginia, the town where she was born. Ever since her mother was killed by vampires, Eleanor and her father have been moving around from town to town. Her father, living in constant fear of vampires and distrustful of everyone, believes that the vampires will one day return for Eleanor. However, she believes that her father was so stricken with grief over the death of her mother that he made up the story about the vampires. But Eleanor does not believe that vampires exist. Now, her father has brought them back to Shadow Glen to face the vampires. He knows that they are powerful, so he tries to seek help to gain knowledge that could help him in his fight against the creatures of the night. One day, Eleanor receives an invitation from Priscilla Fear. She wants her to attend her ball at the Fear Manor. But when she tells her father, he quickly tells her no, and that she is not allowed to be outside after dark. Later that night, a strange man cloaked in black came to Eleanor's house to meet with her father. She slipped out of her room and quietly stood outside her father's study. She overheard her father and the stranger talking about vampires. At the end of their conversation, the man handed her father a journal and told him the information inside should be able to help him. He told him that everything he knew about vampires was written in the journal. Just before the stranger was about to leave, Eleanor was discovered by him and her father. The man was introduced as Trevor Fear, the cousin of Priscilla Fear, who had invited her to the ball. After seeing Eleanor, Trevor warns her father that as long as she is in Shadow Glen, she will always be in danger. Trevor then leaves after his final warning. Eleanor began to ask her father more about Trevor, but he grabbed her by the arm and warned her to stay away from him, that Trevor Fear was a dangerous man. Eleanor returns to her room, but she cannot sleep. She couldn't stop thinking about Trevor, or the journal he had left for her father. Finally, she decides to sneak into her father's study and retrieve the journal. She had to know what was written inside. When she returns to her room with the journal, she discovers that the entries are dated over 100 years ago, taking place in a Massachusetts colony named Wickham Village, and the journal belonged to a man named Richard Fear. She assumes he must be a relative of Trevor's. In his journal, Richard's first entry tells the story of the night he met a woman named Gwendolyn. Mesmerized by her beauty, Richard was led into the woods, where she attacked him and fed upon him until he blacked out. When Richard awoke, he was barely hanging on to life. He sees Gwendolyn holding a goblet, which she offers to him. Richard grabs it and gulps it down, unaware that it was filled with vampire blood. He asks Gwendolyn what she has done to him. She then tells him that she has made him one of them, that Richard is now and forevermore a vampire. Eleanor awakes the next morning and begins contemplating what she read in the journal. She didn't know whether to believe the story or to believe that it was just that, a made-up story. Before she can get out of bed, her father begins banging on her bedroom door and asks her if she had taken the journal from his study. She admits to taking it and asks her father if the story is true or not. He tells her that Trevor claims it is real, but Eleanor still doubts the story. Her father then tells her that he has invited Trevor over for dinner so he can gain more knowledge about the vampires. He then sends Eleanor out into town to buy a nice bird for their dinner. Later that day, while she was at the butcher shop, Eleanor runs into her best friend Annie. Annie is an indentured servant for the town's shoemaker, Mr. Dobbin. Eleanor tells her about Trevor and the dinner they are going to have with her father. Annie knows that Eleanor doesn't believe in vampires, but she shares a story about a recent encounter with what Annie believed to be a real vampire. Eleanor still discredits the story, but just before leaving, Annie gives her one last warning to be careful. As Eleanor walks home, she gets the feeling that someone or something is following her. Eventually, she begins to hear her name in the whispering winds. Frightened, she hurries home as quickly as she can. Later that night, Eleanor's mind was still filled with questions, and once again she turns to Richard's journal. The next entry that she reads tells the story of the first night that Richard drank human blood. Him, Gwendolyn, and 3 other vampires went out into town to feed. They preyed upon an innocent miller. Richard drank the man's blood to quench his thirst. He believed that the man would turn into one of them, but Gwendolyn told him to finish off the miller. He refused to kill the man, at which point he vowed he would never feed on another human again. Richard went into the woods in search of more blood. Eventually, a wild boar came after him, and even though Richard was weak from fighting the urge to feed, he was still strong enough to overpower a wild animal. After he drank the blood from the animal, he tossed the dead body aside and realized that he would do anything to end the constant craving for blood. Chapter 7. Gently, Eleanor closed the journal. Tears stung her eyes. Poor Richard, she thought sadly. How horrible to become such a loathsome creature. The words in the journal could not be true, she told herself. Vampires did not exist. And yet, Richard's words made her believe that his sorrow and his pain were real. His loneliness was as great as hers. She could sense it in every word she read. It had driven him to madness, to believe he lived in a world where vile monsters fed on human blood. Eleanor touched her fingers to the worn leather. She wished she could have held him, comforted him. She shook her head with a rueful smile. If she didn't know better, she'd think she was falling in love with the man who wrote the journal. With a sigh, she set the journal on the table beside the bed. She buried herself beneath the blankets and watched the shadows dance over the ceiling, and waited for the dawn. It was just after dusk when Eleanor heard the clip-clop of horses' hooves and the whir of carriage wheels. Her hands shook with excitement as she set the roasted turkey on the oak table. She wiped her damp hands on her white starched apron. The table was covered with their best linen cloth. Fine English china and sterling silver place settings gleamed in the candlelight. She heard a rapid-fire knock on the door, and her heartbeat quickened. Licking dry lips, she opened the door, and her heart almost stopped beating. Trevor Fear stood within the shadows of the night. The street lantern cast a halo around him. His cloak billowed in the wind, slapping at his legs. His black pants were tucked into shiny black boots. He tilted his head slightly. "Miss Rawlins." "Mr. Fear," she replied breathlessly. Amusement flickered in his dark eyes. "Will you not invite me in? The winds are cold tonight." Of course," Eleanor stammered. Embarrassment scalded her cheeks. She had no idea how long she had been staring at him. He was more handsome than she remembered. She waved her hand in a wide arc. "Please, come in." Trevor stepped through the doorway. "Let me take your cloak," she offered. "I am still cold," he said quietly. "I have a fire burning in the hearth in the dining room." She scurried to her father's study. "Father, Mr. Fear is here." Trevor Fear murmured in a low voice. Startled, Eleanor spun around and found him standing very close to her. She had not heard him move, but he was studying her face as though he sought to memorize every line and curve. Her father stepped between them and briefly shook Trevor's gloved hand. "I appreciate your coming." Eleanor followed her father and Trevor into the dining room. Her father sat at his chair at the head of the table. Trevor sat across from him. Eleanor took her seat and graciously served her guest first, then her father, then herself. All the while, she could feel Trevor watching her. The silence grew thick and heavy, as though no one knew what to say. She noticed that Trevor had not begun to eat. "Don't you like wild turkey?" she asked. She had prepared it carefully, hoping to please him. He gazed at his plate, then lifted his gaze to her. "I apologize. I awoke from a nap with a headache and decided that the pain would ease if I ate. I'm afraid I ruined my appetite." He smiled warmly. "Although everything smells delicious." "I can wrap up some of the meal so you can take it home," Eleanor suggested. He seemed to hesitate, and she wondered if she had prepared food he didn't enjoy. Then his smile deepened. "You are very generous, Miss Rawlins. I'd like that." Yes, her father said impatiently. "Do what you will with the food. But tell me, Trevor, how can I look at a man and know he is a vampire?" Eleanor saw Trevor's gaze turn toward her father. She expected him to laugh like everyone else did when her father mentioned vampires. Instead, Trevor spoke as though the subject were a normal topic of conversation. "There is no way to tell. They look the same as you or I do." Eleanor felt her stomach quiver. Had Richard looked like any other man? If she had met him, would she have seen a madman, or simply a man lost in loneliness? And how, she wondered, could Trevor possibly believe that he was anything else? Her father did not seem pleased with Trevor's answer. "The stories I have read say that vampires are deathly pale." "That is because the vampire legend has existed for many centuries in many countries," Trevor said. "You will also find stories that say a vampire takes the shape of a bat. I believe all legends begin with two things." "And what are those?" Eleanor asked. Trevor's dark gaze shifted to her. "Truth and fear," he said. "Over time, people alter the truth to conquer their fear." "People are terrified of vampires," her father agreed. "But they have reason to be. I have seen what those creatures can do." Eleanor did not want to talk about her father's obsession. She did want to understand how a normal person could believe in mythical creatures. "What sort of truth would lead to a tale of creatures that suck blood to survive?" she asked. Trevor shrugged. "Who can really say?" "There are indeed bats who drink blood," her father said. "Yes," Trevor admitted, "but they rarely feed on humans. Perhaps the truth lies elsewhere. Perhaps a man was presumed to be dead, when in fact he was not. Physicians can make mistakes. This man was then prepared for burial. Yet, as he was being lowered into the grave, he awoke and began to beat on the lid of the coffin. Naturally, His awakening frightened his neighbors, and they believed he was some sort of supernatural creature returned from the dead. Perhaps the fear of vampires is actually a fear of premature burial. Eleanor shuddered with the thought of a living person being buried by mistake. "Is that what you think it is?" she asked. "You think that is the basis for the legend of the vampire?" Trevor Fear leaned toward her, his eyes growing darker. "No, Miss Rollins. I believe vampires exist. You want to convince me that they don't." She felt the pulse at the base of her throat jump. "What makes you believe?" she whispered hoarsely. "I have spent a lot of time studying stories, listening to legends, and searching for journals that can prove the existence of vampires," he told her. "Like the journal you brought my father," she said. "Yes. With such an unusual relative in my family history, I felt obliged to prove the truth of his words. But what if Richard Fear was simply writing a story? He wrote his life as he lived it," Trevor said flatly. "Did you kill him?" her father suddenly asked. "No," Trevor answered. "But you know how to kill vampires," her father stated. "You know how to find them." Eleanor saw Trevor's jaw clench and his eyes harden. "Yes." "Tell me how to destroy them," her father demanded. She watched Trevor slowly shake his head. "You cannot even guess at their powers. You must stay away from them." "I have spent my life trying to stay away from them. Running. Always running," her father insisted. "I have made Eleanor's life miserable." Eleanor gasped and stared at her father. Understanding filled his eyes. Reaching out, he covered her hand. "Yes, daughter. I know you are lonely, and it is my fault, but I only wanted to protect you. Instead, I have made you unhappy." She shook her head vigorously. "No, father, I am not unhappy. I'm just miserable," he finished for her. He smiled sadly, then looked at Trevor. "That is why I finally returned to Shadow Glen, to face them head on. Tell me how to find them and destroy them." "I cannot," Trevor insisted quietly. "You cannot, or you will not?" her father asked. Trevor seemed to hesitate, his dark eyes focused on Eleanor. Then he sighed deeply. "I cannot help you," he said with resignation. Her father's chair crashed to the floor as he pushed himself to his feet. The harsh sound echoed through the room. Eleanor had never seen her father so angry. He pointed a shaking finger at Trevor. "You are a coward," he thundered. "Get out of my house." Slowly, Trevor rose to his feet. His gaze met Eleanor's, and his eyes asked for understanding. "You must convince your father to take you away from here," he told her. "If he does not, you will die exactly as your mother did." Chapter 8. Stunned, Eleanor stared at Trevor. "What do you mean?" "Get out!" her father shouted at him. "You say you know how to destroy vampires, yet you will not help me. Instead, you frighten my daughter. I will find them and kill them myself." Eleanor's gaze darted between Trevor and her father, trying to understand what was going on. "Please," Trevor said, his voice strained. "If you try to fight them, you will only put Eleanor in greater danger. Leave this place tonight, while you still can." "No," her father shouted. "I am tired of running, tired of dragging my daughter from town to town. It solves nothing. The only way to save her is to end it, now." "But please, I beg you." "Get out of my house, coward," her father spat. Trevor spun on his heel and stormed from the room. Eleanor jerked her gaze to her father. "Father, I don't understand." "Go to your room, now." He pounded his fist on the table. "They took your mother from me. I will not let them take you. I will kill them. I swear, I will kill them all." Eleanor ran from the room, but she did not go to her bedroom. She grabbed her cloak and rushed out of the house. She had to find Trevor. She had to find out why she was in danger. She ran from the back of the house into the alley. There was no sign of Trevor or of his carriage. Perhaps he had gone through town. She raced toward the road that led to the center of Shadow Glen. Her boot heels echoed on the damp cobblestones. She couldn't hear any other sound. Gasping for breath, Eleanor stumbled to a stop. She had run without thought into the night, into the darkness. She had never been outside at night. She had not realized how frightening the night could be. Darkness surrounded her. There was no moon. Behind her, the candles in the street lamps were lit, but their pale glow barely penetrated the fog that rolled in from the river. She felt lost and unsure. She spun around. Where was the house? How far had she run? The misty fog swirled around her. She heard the muffled sound of hoofbeats in the distance. She was too late. Trevor was already on his way home, and she felt someone behind her. Eleanor spun around. Cloaked in black, a tall, menacing shadow moved slowly toward her. Eleanor bit back a scream and turned to flee. She was too slow. The figure clamped a strong hand around her arm, dragging her back. "What are you doing out here?" a deep voice demanded. She recognized the voice, Trevor's voice. She collapsed against him, breathing hard. "You frightened me," she confessed. He slipped his gloved hand beneath her trembling chin and lifted it. "Do you know how dangerous it is for you to walk the streets at night?" he asked. She searched his face, his eyes, wanting to find the truth. "How do you know I am in danger?" "I cannot tell you, but you must trust me. You and your father must leave this place, tonight." "Why?" Eleanor asked. "Why must we leave Shadow Glen, and in such a hurry?" He pressed a finger to her lips. "If I could, Eleanor, I would tell you every secret, every truth. But if I tell you anything at all, I only place you in more danger." "You have to tell me more than that," she insisted. But Trevor did not reply. He simply took her hand. "Come, I must take you home." She fell into step beside him. "Then tell me something else. Exactly how are you related to Richard Fear?" He glanced down at her. "He is a distant relative. His story has always fascinated me." "Then you believe all that he wrote?" she asked hesitantly. "Yes," he answered without doubt. "But you do not believe what you read." Slowly she shook her head. "Perhaps he was insane." "He was not insane," Trevor insisted, although often he stood on the brink of madness when the need to taste blood grew too strong. "You speak as if you knew him," Eleanor said. "All that I know of him is contained in the journal," Trevor murmured. "Can you imagine never feeling the sun upon your face, to forever be cold, even in the heat of summer?" He ducked his head as though embarrassed. "I pity him is all, and his kind." "I do not mean to doubt your relative's story," Eleanor said quietly. Trevor gave a weary sigh. "I do not blame you for not believing. Few people do." Eleanor peered up at him. She was struck again by his handsome features. Yet now she also noticed a loneliness about him, a sadness in the shadowed pools of his eyes. "How much of the journal did you read?" he asked. Startled from her thoughts, she swallowed hard. "I read about the night that Richard claims he became a vampire, and the night he tasted human blood." Trevor shifted his gaze away from her. He was such a young man. He had come to the New World from England. He had such hopes. "Even though you have only read about him, you love him," she whispered in awe. "I despise him," Richard spat out. "I despise what he was forced to do to survive. But he has family," he added quietly, "and I have little family left." "You have Priscilla, don't you?" she asked. He came to a stop. "What do you know of Priscilla?" "She invited me to her winter ball, but father will not let me go," Eleanor said. She was unable to keep the disappointment out of her voice. "She did not tell me she had invited you," Trevor said in a distant tone. "What does Priscilla think of Richard?" Eleanor asked. "I never speak to her of Richard, or vampires," he muttered. She would not understand. Eleanor's house loomed in the fog. She had not realized they were so close. She felt a surge of disappointment. She did not wish to leave Trevor's company. She turned back to him. What would she not understand? He led her up the front steps until they stood beside the door. "Priscilla would not understand Richard's loneliness," he replied. "Richard was alone, always alone." "I know what that is like," Eleanor said quietly. Trevor cupped her face in his gloved hands. Strangely, Richard's loneliness increased when he met someone he thought he could love. Eleanor's breath caught as he lowered his head towards hers. He is going to kiss me, she thought wildly. Then his lips touched hers, gentle, but cold from the wintry night air. Suddenly, he pulled back. Regret filled his dark eyes. "I'm sorry. I shouldn't have kissed you." Before she could respond, he dashed off the front steps and was swallowed by the fog. All she could see was the pale glow of a street lamp in the distance. Eleanor pressed her trembling fingers to her lips. They were as cold as his had been. Shivering, she wrapped her arms around herself. "I'm glad you kissed me," she said aloud. "I just wish you had stayed longer." She turned and put her hand on the doorknob. Before she could turn it, she heard a high-pitched wail of agony coming from the house. "Father!" she cried as she threw open the door. She rushed inside. The door to her father's study stood ajar. A blast of cold night air hit her as she stepped into the room. The glass doors that led onto the terrace were open. The only light in the room was the fire, burning low in the hearth. She saw her father's feet jerking. His desk hid the rest of his body. She rushed across the room and rounded the desk. With a gasp, she staggered to a stop. Her father lay on the floor, twitching spasmodically. Blood spurted from his chest with each beat of his heart. Blood spurted around the wooden stake that had been embedded in his chest. "Father!" Eleanor cried. She knelt beside him and took his shaking hand in hers. "Father, don't die. Please don't die. I love you." Her father's eyes bulged. The blood pooled over his chest and flowed onto the floor. It soaked through her skirt. She could feel the dampness against her knees, but she didn't care. "Help me!" she screamed. "Will someone please help me?" But she knew there was no one to hear her. Her father opened his mouth, and the blood ran in a rivulet onto his chin. "Who did this?" she demanded as she felt him weakening. Her father gasped for a final breath. Blood bubbled out of his mouth. He rasped one last word. "Trevor." Chapter 9. "Father!" Eleanor cried as his chest rose one final time. She flung herself across him. He did not move. He would never move again, even as blood had ceased to flow since his heart no longer beat. Tears stung her eyes and trailed down her cheeks. Perhaps her father had been overly protective, but she had loved him all the same. Eleanor whirled as she heard a creaking noise. Behind her, Trevor was closing the doors that led to the garden. Had he been there when her father died? Was that the reason her father had named him? She watched Trevor cross the room in long strides. "What happened?" he asked, an edge to his voice. Eleanor did not answer. She wrapped her hands around the wooden stake jutting out of her father's chest. Splinters dug into her palms as she worked the stake back and forth, trying to free it. She cringed as she heard her father's ribs crack. With a sudden sucking sound, the stake came free. Eleanor tumbled back, her bottom slamming against the wooden floor. Her breath came in harsh, ragged gasps as she got to her feet. A bright red rage hovered at the edge of her vision. "You!" she spat out. "You did this!" She saw Trevor's gaze dart between her and her father's still form. "You murdered him!" she shouted. "No." He held out a hand. "Please, Eleanor, listen to me." She laughed hysterically. "I asked him who did this. He named you with his dying breath." "I did not kill your father," Trevor insisted. "Then why are you here?" "I heard his cry. I came running, but I quickly saw that I was too late. I only wanted to close the doors to protect you." "I don't believe you," she screamed. She rushed across the room, holding the stake high above her head. She lunged at Trevor, but he easily sidestepped her. A sob of despair rose in Eleanor's throat as Trevor grabbed her from behind. His hands were like steel bands, pinning her arms to her sides. "Why did you kill him?" she demanded. He released his hold on her. "I told you I would never harm your father." "Then who did?" she asked. "Vampires," he said. Eleanor felt the rage rising again. "Do not talk to me of imaginary creatures when my father lies dead at my feet." "Vampires are far from imaginary," Trevor said quietly. "I have made no secret of the fact that I believe in them, and so should you. You read the journal," he reminded her. "Richard Fear's words are simply the ravings of an unstable man," she argued. "They are the truth," Trevor insisted. "If they are, then I am not afraid. I'll gladly risk death to avenge my father's murder." "That is only because you don't understand the risks," Trevor told her. "Death would be a kindness in comparison. It is more likely that you will not die, that instead they will turn you into one of their own. Do you know what that means?" She glowered at him. "That I will drink blood?" "Worse, you will never see the sunlight, never again linger over the beauty of the sunset or a sunrise. You will become a prisoner of the night," he said. "And I am not a prisoner now? They killed my father. What is to stop them from killing me?" "Nothing," he admitted reluctantly. "Nothing." Eleanor watched as he turned away from her and stood before the hearth, staring blankly into the withering flames. She took a step toward him. "Then help me," she pleaded. "I can't," he said solemnly. "I can't help you search out and destroy the vampires." He peered at her. "But I can keep you safe. I'll purchase you passage to anywhere you want to go, to wherever you have family. The distance does not matter. As a matter of fact, the further away you go, the better. I have no family, Eleanor admitted. There is no one I can turn to. There must be someone, Trevor insisted. My father's obsession with vampires made everyone uncomfortable. We had no friends, and if I have family, they disowned us long ago. Besides, I will not leave, she insisted. Not until those who killed my father are punished. Trevor's dark eyes were furious. And if they kill you, who will care? She asked. I will care, he thundered. Trembling, Eleanor sat down on the sofa and tried to make sense of what she had seen and heard. Do you have other proof that vampires exist? She asked in a dazed voice. He turned away from her so she could not see his face. None that I can give you, he replied. Do you know who killed my father? She asked warily. He looked down at her. Only that they are vampires. Eleanor stood up, glaring at Trevor Fear. Then you must have brought them here, she accused. In all these years since my mother's death, they have never bothered us. And now they killed my father? You brought them here. No, Eleanor, I did not bring them here. Then who did? She asked. You did, he said quietly. What do you mean? It is you they want. That is why I urged your father to take you from this place. But he would not listen. He was determined to avenge your mother's death and protect you. Now they have seen to it that he will not stand in their way by keeping you prisoner after dark. She remembered the voices in the woods, the voices promising that she would not escape them. Had she unwittingly caused her father's death? No, the voices were her imagination, and vampires were the ravings of a madman. Nothing made sense. She only knew her father was dead, and Trevor was telling her stories that a child would not believe. Liar! She screamed. She rushed across the room. Trevor did not move. She got closer, closer. She raised the wooden stake and brought it down. The bloody tip pointed at his chest, aimed at his heart, but Trevor did not move. She met his dark, unwavering gaze. Why? She asked. Sympathy filled his eyes. They have been waiting for you to grow up. That is why your father was desperate to kill them, because he knew they would come for you. I give you my word, Eleanor. As I stand before you, this is the truth. I would not lie to you. Eleanor's mind whirled. She no longer knew what was real or imaginary. Trevor drew her into the circle of his arms. She wanted, needed, the comfort he offered. Where is your room? He asked gently. Upstairs, but I think we should get the magistrate, she stammered. I'll take care of it, he told her. But first, I must take care of you. You're as cold as a block of ice. With a candle to guide them, Trevor led her up the stairs to her room. Eleanor sat on the bed while he knelt before the hearth. Within minutes she heard the crackling of a new fire. Why a stake through the heart? She wondered aloud. Perhaps they killed him the way he planned to kill them, he suggested. Do you think they will try to kill me? I won't let anyone harm you. You'll be safe from vampires once the sun comes up, and until it rises, I will stay here to protect you. He walked to the door. Try and sleep. She watched him leave, closing the door quietly behind him. Sleep. How could she possibly sleep with her father's bloodied corpse lying one floor below her? She changed into her nightgown and crawled beneath the blankets. She was now completely alone in the world. She had no mother and no father. She could not imagine her future. Silently, so that Trevor would not hear, she hid her face in her hands and began to weep. Chapter 10. Eleanor woke as shafts of sunlight pierced her room. Her eyes felt as if they were filled with sand. Her face was puffy. Who killed my father? She wondered. Why? Why did they kill him? She dragged herself out of bed and slowly dressed. The grief weighed heavy on her heart. She dreaded all she would have to face that day. Slowly she walked down the stairs. Her heart pounding, she peered into her father's study. An empty room greeted her. Her father's body was gone. She saw that Trevor had washed away most of the blood, but still the wooden floor was darkened and stained with her father's blood. Eleanor pressed her hand to her mouth, stifling her sob. I must make arrangements, she thought. I must bury my father. She searched the house but could not find Trevor. He said I would be safe once the sun rose, she remembered. Vampires avoid the sun. She heard the loud knocking on the door. Fear swept through her. She was alone now, truly alone. She crept to the door. Who is there? Reverend Allen, a voice boomed. She opened the door. A tall, thin man stood on her porch. No compassion filled his eyes. "Trevor Fear brought your father to me last night. He paid for a coffin and burial. Your father's service will be late this afternoon," Reverend Allen said. Tears stung Eleanor's eyes. She had not expected Trevor to make the arrangements. "Thank you, Reverend," she said quietly. "Your father's death is a sad thing, but at least he is now free of his insane rantings about vampires." Eleanor rose to her father's defense. "Every man is entitled to his own beliefs," she pointed out. "But his ruined his life. You should leave Shadow Glen, Eleanor. This place will only hold unhappy memories for you." Reverend Allen turned abruptly and walked away. Eleanor closed the door and leaned against it. Her mind was spinning with questions. Had one of the villagers killed her father because they were afraid of him? Why did Trevor pay for the coffin and burial? Did he feel guilty? Responsible? Or was he simply kind? What was her father trying to tell her? Why did he whisper Trevor's name with his dying breath? Was Trevor the only person she could trust, or the only person she couldn't trust? She felt dizzy from so many unanswered questions. The night before was a blur, a hazy nightmare. She remembered that Trevor left her by the front door. He disappeared into the night. Where was he when her father screamed? He said he did not kill her father, but could she believe him? Should she believe a man who asked for her trust, but would not tell her how he knew she was in danger? Why had he returned? How did he know to return? Why had her father spoken Trevor's name? Later that morning, Eleanor set off for town. She needed to get out of the house, away from the feeling of death that still hovered within. The winter winds howled as she walked, as if they were mocking her, taunting her, bringing her a world that was hollow and empty and frozen. The town seemed even quieter than it had been 2 days before. Shops were shuttered, the streets empty, as if everyone were huddled inside, hiding from the bitter cold. Eleanor came to a small house on the edge of town, Mr. Dobbin's house. She walked around to the back and knocked on the wooden kitchen door. Annie opened the door. Her green eyes widened. "Are you crazy walking about in this cold, Ellie?" She grabbed Eleanor's arm. "Get inside before you freeze to death." Eleanor felt the warmth of the room envelop her as Annie led her to a chair before the hearth. "Sit here," Annie commanded. Obediently, Eleanor sat. She felt numb. Even the warmth of the fire made no difference. Annie handed her a mug. "Here's some warm milk. I've put a dash of cinnamon and sugar into it, but don't tell the evil Dobbin. He hoards the sugar like gold." Eleanor wrapped her hands around the earthen mug. She sipped on the sweet brew and felt the warmth swirl through her. It thawed the chill around her heart and made tears well in her eyes. "Oh, Annie," she sobbed. Annie knelt beside her. "What's happened, Eleanor?" "Someone murdered my father last night. They drove a stake through his heart. They're going to bury him this afternoon." The tears began to flow fast and furiously. Annie wrapped her arms around Eleanor's quaking body. She did not question her or speak. Eleanor was grateful. She did not want to describe the horror she had seen last night. Eleanor cried until she could cry no more. Then she wiped the tears from her eyes and straightened up. "I don't know what I'm going to do," she said. "I have no one." "You have me," Annie insisted. Eleanor gave her a quivering smile. "I mean that I have no family I can turn to. I cannot farm the land on my own. I have no way to make a living." "Whatever you do, don't become a servant," Annie advised. "I wish I could purchase your indentured papers," Eleanor said. She felt sorry for her friend. Annie shrugged. "I only have 6 more years, although it seems like 1,000 when I think about it." She squeezed Eleanor's hand tightly. "But your problems are worse. What will you do?" Eleanor met her friend's troubled gaze and spoke the stark truth. "I don't know." Later that afternoon, Eleanor stood in the graveyard. She stared at the gaping black hole in the earth. It looked like a mouth, open wide, waiting to devour its victim. Annie stood beside her, holding her hand tightly. The cold wind whipped around them, moaned through the trees, a mourning sound that sent shivers racing along Eleanor's spine. Her gaze roamed the cemetery. The headstones leaned crookedly as though the ground had shifted beneath them. Eleanor paid no attention to Reverend Allen's droning voice. No one else from the village was there. Few people mourned the man who spoke of vampires as though they were real. Only Annie and Reverend Allen and the 2 men who began to lower her father's coffin into the earth. Where was Trevor, she wondered. Why hadn't he come? She saw the pine box sway with the wind. It creaked as though straining to stay out of the ground. But they ignored its protests and lowered it, slowly, Slowly, Eleanor's heart grew tighter and tighter. Grief sliced through her like the rusty edge of a knife. The coffin landed with an ominous thud. The lid popped free. Gnarled fingers crept through the narrow opening and shoved the lid aside. Eleanor watched in horror as her father sat up. His face was bluish-gray. Eleanor gasped, remembering Trevor's story about thinking a man was dead when he wasn't. It was true. They had nearly buried a live man. She took a step forward, reaching for her father. His eyes glowed red. He opened his mouth, and his vicious smile revealed sharp, pointed fangs. Chapter 11. Eleanor, her father's voice was a ragged whisper. Be a good daughter, and help me out of this grave. He held out a hand to her. His fingernails glinted long and sharp, like razor blades. No, Eleanor said hoarsely. She stepped back from the open grave. The loose earth shifted beneath her, and her foot slid. She was falling, into the open grave, into her father's waiting arms. She landed with a jolt. Ellie! Annie cried. Eleanor shook her head, dazed. She was lying on top of the wooden coffin. The coffin was closed, the lid still in place. She ran her fingers over the nails in the top. The lid hadn't opened. She imagined it all. Ellie? Annie cried. Eleanor glanced up. Annie stared at her, her eyes wide. What happened? Annie asked. I fell, Eleanor stammered. She could not admit that she'd imagined her father to be a vampire. Reverend Allen held out a hand and lifted her out of the open grave. Eleanor stood silently as the gravediggers began to shovel earth on top of the coffin. Leave here, Eleanor, the Reverend said. She knew he meant not only to leave the cemetery, but to leave Shadow Glen as well. No, she told him. I won't leave until I know who killed my father. She spun on her heel and began to walk away. She heard the rhythmic thump of dirt falling onto the grave. That sound, it was so final. Dirt covering the pine box, covering her father. Tears blurred her vision. She stumbled over the root of a tree. Annie steadied her. It'll be all right, Ellie. Eleanor roughly wiped away the tears and continued on. I thought Trevor might come, she whispered in a husky voice. Maybe he's busy trying to find those who killed your father, Annie suggested. If he's searching for anyone, he'll search for vampires, Eleanor told her. He believes they murdered my father. Then perhaps he'll come to the cemetery, Annie said. Eleanor stopped abruptly and spun around. Why? Annie glanced around cautiously, as though afraid someone might be listening in the shadows. The sun was beginning to set. Darkness was rolling over the land. I have heard that if you ride a horse through a graveyard, it'll shy away from the graves where vampires sleep. Eleanor rolled her eyes. Where did you hear that? Annie shrugged. I overheard a woman tell Mr. Dobbin that while he was repairing her shoes. Everyone in town has been talking about vampires lately. Maybe they were beginning to believe your father. Then why did someone kill him? Eleanor asked. But Annie had no answer. As evening drew near, Eleanor returned to her home. It had been a long, difficult day. After the funeral, she and Annie visited the magistrate. He seemed untroubled by her father's death. He even hinted that it was a good thing they no longer had a man who talked about vampires living in their community. Eleanor was shocked and hurt by his attitude. She was even more hurt that only Annie comforted her. I am truly alone, she realized. Now she entered her father's study. Her heart was heavy with grief. She glanced around the familiar room. Her father had spent many hours working at his desk. When she was a child, she often climbed on his lap and watched him work. He never scolded her for disturbing him. Twilight shadows hovered around her as she knelt before the hearth. She built a fire and stared at the flames that roared to life. She turned slightly and smiled. A piece of yellow ribbon dangled out of one of the drawers in her father's desk. She pulled the ribbon free. It was frayed and worn. The ribbon had decorated her first bonnet. Her father kept it all these years. She pulled open the drawer and peered inside. Tears stung her eyes as she reached for a familiar cloth doll. The doll's face had embroidered eyes, nose, and mouth. Her father gave her the doll when she was 6. She remembered that it originally had black eyes. Her father had removed the black threads and sewn in blue ones so that the doll's eyes would match hers. And now he had saved her old friend for her. Eleanor hugged the doll close against her chest. Tears slid down her cheeks. Outside the house, she heard a muffled sound. She froze, her heart hammering. She heard quiet footsteps. "Eleanor?" A soft voice sang out. Eleanor didn't recognize the voice. Tendrils of dread wove through her. A stranger. A stranger was waiting outside her house. She jerked her gaze toward the window. It was black outside. Night had fallen. She couldn't remember if she locked the door. She heard the front door open. Footsteps creaked across the wooden floorboards. The footsteps grew nearer, nearer. The stranger was coming to her father's study. The intruder would find her. Quietly, she knelt and reached for the poker by the fireplace. She wrapped her hands around the hard iron. The only light in the room came from the fire burning in the hearth. Shadows hovered in the corners and reached into the room, wisps of gray and black. The footsteps came much closer. The intruder was in her father's study. Eleanor leaped to her feet, holding the poker above her head. She saw a figure emerge from the darkness and step into the light. Her fingers uncurled around the poker. It crashed to the floor with a resounding echo. The figure smiled. "Eleanor Rollins, I have been searching for you."